From the Western Mass News studios in Springfield, this is Western Mass News Getting Answers with Dave Mattson.
Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of Western Mass News Getting Answers. Good to have you with us. Every week, I'm joined by federal, state, and local leaders and newsmakers to talk about the issues that impact you. This week, we're getting answers from First Hampden, Hampshire District State Senator Eric Lesser. Senator Lesser first elected in November 2014 by voters in the district's 9 communities. Now, time permitting, the senator and I are going to focus on the state's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, his mission to bring rail service from Boston to Springfield, to transform and economically develop the region, and how redistricting could impact Western Massachusetts. Senator Lesser, welcome. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Yeah.
We have this social distancing again.
I feel we're so far apart, but so close at the same time.
I know, and it's going to beat Zoom. Let's put it that way, as we were saying.
Anything beats Zoom at this point. So.
Anything does. Well, let's talk about all this. We're seeing an uptick in COVID cases all across the state. How concerned are you about the resurgence and its potential impact on the state's economy and the people who live and work here?
Well, it is concerning because, of course, we had gotten our rates so low here in Massachusetts, and really nationally, the rates had come down very low. One thing that I do think we do know is that the vaccines remain very effective, and probably the single most effective tool we have for dampening Delta and getting it under control is continuing to focus on expanding vaccine access and vaccine uptick. So I think it's very important that the state really double down on continuing to get vaccines out to people who are eligible, making sure that some of the pockets and regions of the state where the rates are still low in terms of vaccination, that we continue to focus on that. But it is a concern, and I do think if it's not brought under control, it could really do a lot of damage to the progress we've seen over the last several months.
I know the governor's under a lot of pressure to issue a statewide mask mandate. How do you feel about that?
I think a statewide mask mandate across the board right now is probably not the right approach. I think, again, we know that the vaccines are very effective. I think for schools, it is appropriate because, of course, people under 12 cannot yet get the vaccine. And schools have to operate, I think, with a heightened sense of safety and a sense of comfort for families. We cannot go back to remote school. That would be a disaster for families, would be a disaster for communities. We cannot go back to remote school. In order to protect that, to ensure that we're back to as normal operating as possible 5 days a week with a full school day, I think a mask mandate is appropriate to ensure that. But again, it's going to depend on keeping an eye on the R rate, or the rate of spread of the virus. And we do know, and the pediatricians have said this, that the most effective way to protect kids is surrounding them by adults who are vaccinated. So we've got to continue to keep our eye on the ball and stay focused on the vaccination effort.
That said, do you agree or disagree with the businesses mandating their employees to get the vaccination?
I support a business's decision to mandate for their employees. Again, an appropriate, narrowly tailored religious exemption, a medical exemption if that's necessary. But the reality of it is, Dave, is we have all kinds of vaccine requirements, measles, smallpox, you name it. This is not a particularly new thing in terms of public health or in terms of the medical community. So I think at this point it is appropriate if a business says, we're going to mandate a vaccine. That's a decision that I would support, with obviously the caveat that there is a narrowly tailored religious exemption. There's a way to maybe do testing once a week if people very strongly feel they need to opt out of it. We have to keep that in mind. But generally speaking, I think the mandates are the right approach.
Now, you're one of many legislators who signed on to the COVID-19 housing equity bill. That was just in the paper. We're taping this on Thursday this morning. Let's talk about that. What's the potential impact of that legislation?
Well, so I think something that we need to appreciate is we've made a lot of progress, and there is a lot of aid available right now for families that might still be struggling from COVID-19 and who are facing eviction. I don't think that it is in the interest of our community or in the interest of public health to evict people in the middle of Delta surging and in the middle of COVID still continuing to be an issue people have to worry about. The other thing I would point out, Dave, is while we have made a lot of progress on the economy recovering, we are still at significantly higher unemployment rates than we were before COVID-19, and we still have large sectors, especially hospitality, entertainment, conferences, travel, logistics, that have not returned to their pre-COVID employment numbers. So we have a lot of people still struggling. We need to give time for those aid programs to work their way through. We need the state to make some improvements to speed up those aid programs. In the meantime, I think it's important for us to make sure that if you are facing COVID-19 related issues, that you're not going to be evicted during that process. And that includes, by the way, help for our small landlords who are also struggling. Not every landlord is a big corporate landlord. You have a lot of families that maybe have a unit that they're renting. They rely on that income. So we've got to make sure that we're getting help to those small landlords too, so that we can make this work for everyone.
Now, how do we get people back to work? There are just so many businesses. Talking with Bay State Health in our last program, that there are 1,000 positions short.
Yeah.
What do we do for an incentive to get people to apply for these jobs and go back to work? Because so many of them were used to getting money from the state and the federal government, and some were making more money than they were making when they were working. Yeah,
there's some evidence that was the case. Certainly when the $600 was in effect, but we actually now do have data we can look at, because you've got about 30 states that have that prematurely ended their unemployment expansion, and then you have a balance of states, including Massachusetts, that has chosen not to do that. And the reality of it is there still are employment shortage issues even in the states that have turned off that assistance. So I don't think that that's the right approach. I think people need this help to pay their bills, to pay the rent. We just talked about the eviction crisis that we're handling. I think what you've seen here is actually a broader restructuring of the economy that happened while COVID was going on. So, for example, you're going to have potential whole sectors that will permanently be at lower employment levels because of automation, because of just changes in behavior. And then you have other sectors like warehousing, delivery drivers that are seeing record demand, and there's a mismatch there. So we've got to do more around training. We've got to retrain people to get them to where the jobs are growing. We've got to do more around job fairs. There's a statewide job fair, the first one in Massachusetts history, happening this week. So this is also something that our Future of Work Commission that I co-chair is going to be looking at, which is how do we get people back to work in an economy that's changing very fast. And the center of action, I think, for that, Dave, is going to be our job training centers. We're going to need people to learn new technologies, new IT services, new skills that they might not have had before COVID that are now very much in demand after COVID. And I think the employer community and the private sector community has got to do its part, bring wages up, that are actually in line with people's living. I mean, I've got young kids, the cost of childcare, the cost of all of these different issues in modern life. They've got to meet both ways. Employers have got to do their part in terms of bringing wages up. Employees have to do their part in terms of getting skills that are relevant and that are in demand for the new economy we're in.
Let's talk more about the Future of Work Commission. You've had virtual public hearings. What do you hope to achieve through the commission itself?
Yeah, so it's a very exciting project. Something I've been very passionate about for a while. It was included in the economic development bill that I was the lead negotiator for, that the governor signed into law in January. Basically what this is doing is, by design, it's zooming out. It's taking a 40,000 foot high view of the economy in Massachusetts. It's asking, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, what's work going to look like? What's our economy going to look like? And how do we make sure that we're prepared to include people in that growth, in that change, so that we're making the most of these changes? I actually view this with a lot of optimism, because I think there's been a lot of talk about automation, about robotics, about artificial intelligence, and all of the potential that has to destroy jobs. I do think that that's a big concern, but the other way to look at that is it creates new opportunities for new jobs, new ways to raise living standards for people. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Just to give you a sense of this, Dave, McKinsey just recently did a report that estimated that more than 1.5 million jobs in Massachusetts could become completely remote, meaning that you could be fully remote, working a full job with a full salary. Think about what that does to our transportation system, to commuting patterns. Think about the implications for tax policy. Think about the implications for worker benefits, worker protections. These are some of the highest stakes questions we've got in society right now. You have technology changing at such a rapid rate. Life as we know it has changed in such dramatic ways. How do we harness that to make sure that we're helping the most number of people?
All right, we're going to talk more about that. We're going to take a little break now. When we come back, the Senator and I are going to talk about his mission to establish high-speed rail between Springfield and Boston. So stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News, Getting Answers. My guest this week is First Hampden, Hampshire District State Senator Eric Lesser. Good to have you with us. Thank you again. We've covered a lot of territory in our first segment. But when you were first campaigning for Senate, and in the years since, you have championed the effort to bring rail service from Boston to Springfield to transform and economically develop the region. Where does that stand right now?
So it's actually at one of the most pivotal moments we've had for a very, very long time in this project. And I'm more energized, frankly, about East-West Rail and the potential for Massachusetts than I have ever. Just backing up for a second, Dave, just some of the topics we've already talked about. Massachusetts is, of course, a great place to live, a great place to grow up. We have so much going for us. But if you look at Eastern Mass and Western Mass, we actually have inverse and complementary challenges. In Eastern Mass, nobody can afford to live. The housing is completely out of control, rents are skyrocketing, and nobody can move around. The traffic is terrible, the T is completely at its max. People are pulling their hair out because you can't move around and you can't live. In Western Mass, we have in many ways the inverse challenge. We have great open space, we have a high quality of life, but we don't have an economy that's growing fast enough or creating enough jobs to keep people here. Rail solves both those challenges. It gives Eastern Mass access to that Western Mass quality of life. It gives Western Mass access to that red-hot economy, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions and helps fight climate change in the process. There is nothing we could do in Massachusetts that would do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than investing in high-speed rail service between Springfield and Boston. And right now we are at a pivotal moment because, as you mentioned, I campaigned on this when I ran as a 28-year-old in 2014. I was laughed out of a lot of rooms when I talked about making this a signature issue to work on. Since then, we overcame Governor Baker's veto. We got a feasibility study done on East-West Rail Service, and we now have the most pro-train president ever, Joe Biden, Amtrak Joe, who has put forth an infrastructure bill that includes record investment in the exact type of regional rail project that this represents. And we have great leadership here in Massachusetts, led by Chairman Neal and Chairman McGovern, Springfield and Worcester both, working on making this happen. So I'm very optimistic. It's still not quite there. We've got to secure the funding federally. We've got to work on having some more support on a state level, but we're closer than we've ever been, and frankly, the project has never been more urgent.
Well, it makes more sense now, what we were talking in the last segment about more and more remote working from home.
Exactly.
That this would just really fit right in.
Exactly, and what you're seeing more and more is companies are moving towards this hybrid work model, right? The era of 9 to 5 in an office, sitting in a cubicle, doing office work is increasingly becoming a thing of the past. Companies, big and small, have said that they're shifting to hybrid work environments. So think about what that could mean for Western Mass, right? That means that somebody who works at Fidelity or State Street or who works at one of these big Boston companies can now live in Western Mass. And they, because it was a hard thing to do, frankly, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, driving back and forth to Boston. But if you only have to be in Boston 1 or 2 days a week, or you only have to be in Western Mass 1 or 2 days a week, well, now all of a sudden you combine that with the rail service and you have a radius of where people that can live that is much, much broader. And you're seeing that with real estate already. You're seeing the increased interest in Western Mass already because people understand that. It's dependent, though, on the rail links. Otherwise, people are going to go to other places, whether it's Portland, Maine, or Providence, Rhode Island, or Worcester, that already have the link, and we're going to be left out again. And I just point people to a really important report that the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission did that showed that the lack of a link has meant tens of thousands of fewer jobs in the Springfield-Hartford economic corridor than we would have had if there had been a link. So frankly, it's going to be an expensive project. Nobody is pretending otherwise, But my feeling on this is you can't afford not to do it. Let's look at what the cost is of not making the investment, and then when you look at it from that perspective, it's actually a good deal, and it's something that we've got to move forward with.
We look at this infrastructure bill that just passed the Senate and looking to get through the House. That's important to this, isn't it, as far as being able to move forward?
It's key, yeah. It's a very important component. I mean, there's no infrastructure project of this scale that's really ever happened without federal partnership and without some sort of federal investment. But that doesn't let the state off the hook from making it a priority. I would point people to one example, which is the Big Dig. That ended up happening because you had Michael Dukakis and Fred Salvucci, who was his Secretary of Transportation at the time, working hand in glove with Joe Moakley and Ted Kennedy to secure the federal money. I mean, this is a little before my time, but Ronald Reagan vetoed the funding, then they overcame the veto. They were working in conjunction with state officials. As soon as the money was secured, they got it to work. Of course, Western Mass was left out of the Big Dig. We all paid for it, but we didn't see the benefits. Now, a generation later, 2 generations later, we have an opportunity for a similarly transformational investment that would help the whole state. So absolutely, we've got to get the help from federal government, but it does not let the governor off the hook for making this a priority on a state level as well.
Now, Amtrak's expanding service on high-speed rail, is that a key element of all this too?
It all goes together. I mean, the Amtrak plan that was put out is basically what they are saying they can do if the infrastructure money is secured. And if you go, you can Google the Amtrak map that they put out. Springfield, Boston is right there. And the other thing I would just say is it's important for all of Western New England, because not only does it connect Springfield to Boston, it connects North Hampden to Boston, it connects Holyoke to Boston, it connects Greenfield to Boston, it connects Hartford to Boston. All of those cities right now are not connected to Boston by rail because of the investments that were made as part of the Obama stimulus back in 2009 on the North-South link, New Haven North. Right. You would now have an entire corridor up and down the Connecticut River Valley that would now be connected to Boston once East-West happens.
Exciting times.
Yeah, very exciting. It's like best of times, worst of times. Sometimes the greatest challenges in life and the greatest setbacks in life bring forth the best opportunities. We've been through a really dark, hard period for people, but I do feel like we're turning a corner now to a future that's really, really going to be very exciting if we get the policy right and if we make the decisions right now.
All right, we take another break. When we come back, the Senator and I are going to talk about the potential impact of redistricting on the House and Senate districts in Western Mass, and touch on the Holyoke Soldiers Home, too. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by State Senator Eric Lesser. Senator, let's talk about the recent census. That could mean some changes to House and Senate districts in Western Mass. What are you hearing, and what's the potential impact on your district?
Well, everything is very preliminary at this point. We just got the sort of batch of data from the federal government that was released nationally. So it was sent in raw format, so it takes a little bit of time to kind of work through all that. But one thing that I think we do know is clear is something that we already knew, something that's been a topic of our conversation the last half hour here, which is for a variety of reasons, largely because of the slow economy we have in Western Mass, there's been a continued shift in population away from Western Mass and towards Eastern Mass. And what that means is, in general, you're going to see a potential for a redistricting process that is going to deprive Western Mass of representation in the legislature and shift that balance east. And I think for a lot of reasons that's very damaging for us. This is why the investments in rail are so important. This is why the investments in broadband, the Future of Work Commission that we're doing, this is why these changes in work patterns and in hybrid work and in investment in our communities are so important. So we don't know exactly how it's going to turn out yet. I'm not a member of the redistricting committee, so I'm certainly paying close attention to it. But I think what you're going to see at every level, congressional level, state senate level, state representative level, is you're going to be seeing this continued shift towards the east, and that's going to spell trouble for us. I mean, already 10 years ago, Western Mass lost a congressional seat. John Olver, of course, his seat was kind of swallowed up by Neil. So we'll see how it goes. But there's going to be a lot left in terms of where the data is and how the decisions and the lines ultimately get drawn.
Yeah, really something that's been going on for the last 50 years. The districts have changed quite a bit here in that time.
Yeah, you've seen again this trend, and it goes back to the deindustrialization. Just a generation or two ago, you had Monsanto, American Bosch, Uniroyal, Chapman Valve, all with 4,000 or 5,000 well-paid employees coming in and out every day. They were all supporting families and communities, in their respective towns and neighborhoods. Those factories closed. Certainly, we've seen, a resurgence and a growth in things like advanced manufacturing and life sciences and healthcare, but it hasn't replaced the jobs that have been lost, and you've seen a decline in population. The key population centers of Western Mass, Pittsfield, Chicopee, Holyoke, Springfield, are all significantly smaller than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. But again, I think it's going to reverse itself because I'm a believer in Western Mass. I'm raising my family here. I think we've got a lot to offer. We need the state doing its part to put investment in, whether it's rail, broadband, schools, a better economic development.
All right, let's talk about the Holyoke Soldiers Home. Really, I think many see it as a systemic failure. What do we do to keep this from happening again? And the other question I have is, how much blame should be put on the Baker administration and even previous administrations for what happened here? Because this just didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, the bottom line is that the Department of Health and Human Services was in charge of the Soldiers Home. They made the appointment authorities. They were in charge. And frankly, there was a long debate and argument between the various factors, elements of state government about who was sort of ultimately in charge of the Soldiers Home. Veteran Services had claimed they were in charge, but ultimately HHS kind of stepped on top of that and said, no, we're in charge. Well, if you're in charge of the Soldiers Home, you've got to frankly be held accountable for what happened there. And I can just tell you, Dave, I remember as that was going on, getting the phone calls from constituents who had loved ones there, getting the phone calls from constituents who worked there, grieving, desperate for help, for support. And I think what was clear, both from the Globe story and from the other investigations that have been done, is there were requests for help. And the requests for help did not come fast enough. So, I think it's a tragedy that will remain, a stain on our Commonwealth and on our state for a long time. What we owe families now is making sure that the investments are made and the changes are made to fix the Soldiers Home today and into the future. And that is happening. $400 million appropriated by the legislature to get a new home built. That process is happening, and that is on schedule right now to be completed, after the construction is done. I think something we also need to keep our eye on, which is a perennial issue, is this attempt to remove veteran services from Western Mass and consolidate them in Eastern Mass. I feel very strongly we have a unique community here in Western Mass. It's a far drive. It's not accessible for people to get to Eastern Mass for veterans care. We need that home in Holyoke, and we need that home in Holyoke serving people who live in the region in Western Mass.
I mean, because there was some talk a few years ago about even shutting Holyoke down and moving those veterans to Chelsea, and I think a lot of people have forgotten about that in the process.
Exactly. I mean, people have I think had some short timelines here in their analysis. The reality of it is it has been a fight to continue to secure funding and support for the Soldiers Home, and it has been for decades. There had been attempts at consolidation. There had been attempts to move it to Boston. There had been attempts to take away its local control, which I also think would have had the effect of, again, closing out access to a lot of people in Western Mass. So this has been a long-running issue, which is all the more reason why accountability needs to go up the food chain, and up the command structure to get some answers and to get some explanations.
We're going to have to end on that.
Thank
Senator
you.
Eric Lesser, good to see you. Thank you for being here this
Thank
week. And we'll do this again. And that does it for us. Western Mass News Getting Answers. Thanks to you at home for watching too. Have a good week. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.